Kelly Alexander Perry. She is a Congressional Science Fellow in the Office of the U.S. Senator Lamar Alexander. She is also a Research Associate in the Materials Science and Technology Divisions at the Oak Ridge Laboratory in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. She received her bachelor degree in chemistry at the University of Vermont and was later awarded her PhD in polymer chemistry from the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in 2008. She will tell us about her work as a staff scientist at the Oak Ridge National Lab and how polymers, energy, and chemistry led her to Washington, D.C.
Great. Well, thanks, Emma. I appreciated the introduction. Can everyone hear me okay? We're good? Great. We'll test that one more time. And I really want to thank Judith. You've heard about her all morning. She's the one that makes all this possible for you guys, plus all the help of the volunteers. And I met her up in D.C. earlier this year, and she invited me down to talk to you guys today. And today I'm going to talk about a woman in science, carving her own way, and how I hope to make a difference with my science. And as you'll see, I also am a very big advocate of volunteering, and so that's really helped lead me along my path over the years. And my path started out actually in Connecticut, and then so we'll talk about what happened in Connecticut. I was there through high school, so we'll go all the way up to where I'm exactly the same age as you guys. And then I went to college in Vermont and then did my PhD in New York. So I'm actually a doctor in polymer chemistry. And I started going down to Tennessee. You guys are incredibly lucky. Not only is Tennessee a wonderful state in its own right, but it has Oak Ridge National Lab, which is literally like a candy store for scientists and engineers. We have about 4,500 employees there, and we have everything from some of the fastest supercomputers in the world to the best electron microscopes, which is what I worked on when I was there, and just incredible people and facilities. And then most recently, I actually started going to Washington, D.C. Last November, I moved there for a temporary off-site assignment, and I'm actually working in the U.S. Senator's office. So the first question I have, so I need a lot of help here, is I've got all this candy. Now, why did I bring all this candy to Tennessee? Do you have any idea what state it came from? Someone raised their hand. What state do you think this candy came from? Tennessee. There we go. So we got a winner. And what kind of places in Tennessee are these from? Are you guys familiar with all the great things going on here? We've got the McGee Foods, which is in Collegedale, Tennessee. And we also have the Mars Candy Company, which had a site in Chattanooga, and then they moved over to Cleveland. So you guys can pass out some of this candy. And Akshay from Germantown, Tennessee. I don't know if you guys know these high schools. You're definitely probably more familiar with them than me. They came to D.C. for a week. They got to go to the White House. They presented their research. And then they competed down to the top 10 of these 40 students got selected. And so actually one of these students, I believe it was Adam Bowman, became 9 out of 10 in the country from your state. And some of the projects they worked on, these are high school seniors. He developed a novel fiber optic technique to study how the plasma moved as the device was discharged. So he's actually discovered an inexpensive way to study plasma discharge in his own garage, or his parents' garage, but it was his device. And then Akshay, he analyzed epileptic EEGs to develop an algorithm to detect oncoming seizures. So he was working in the medical field to help people more. And so now we have another quiz for you. So I need you guys to raise your hands. This is the top 10 people, top 10 high school seniors from this competition this year. And I want you guys to raise your hand for who you think was the #1 winner. So for A, raise your hand. Who thinks A? All right, what about B? Looks pretty smart, hardworking guy. No? C? Anybody? D? Oh, you're close. So D is actually #2. So you definitely get some candy for number 2. So what about E? Who thinks E? Got a couple? Okay. E was #3, so you definitely get some more candy. Gotta run faster. Raise your hand if you were E. I saw another hand over here. You weren't E? Who got? Number 3. Welcome. What about F? Nope. We're looking for number 1. G? Nope. But she's definitely a smart one. This could be you guys. H? Nope. I? We're getting close. So who thinks J? Yes, it was J, and you guys are correct. There we go. So it was actually Sarah Voles. So you can see Sarah's project. Sarah actually looked at increasing the oil content from algae to create an economical, viable biofuel. So one of the ways we use energy in this country really commonly is for transportation and electricity. And so she created biofuels, which is one of the ways that people are looking at making our transportation system operate better. I wanted to talk about my experience in elementary school was about being an inventor. And so one of my first exposures to being a scientist was an inventor contest in my own elementary school in Connecticut. And so I'm a big believer in seeing problems and trying to figure out solutions. And so I love dogs. And we had a dog at home that was having trouble and having accidents in the house. And here I am, the owner of my dog. I have to keep cleaning up after my dog, which is having accidents. And I didn't appreciate it. I think my dog should have to clean up its mess, right? If you make a mess, who cleans it up? You do. So I was like, then my dog should learn to clean up its own mess. And I noticed, observing, as our scientists are always observing what's going on, that my dog would sniff around afterwards, and he liked to sniff on the ground. So here I am with my sponge scrubbing, and he's sniffing on the ground, and I thought, I invented the poo-poo pee-pee cleaner upper, which was taking a sponge and attaching it to my dog's nose, kind of like a loose muzzle, and having him clean up his own mess. And so I put that into my elementary school inventor contest and actually won, and I got to go to New York to compete. That's the end of my competition, though. We all know that we still have to clean up after our dogs, so it didn't get to commercial scale production, but I had dreams. And so just like some of these scientists later on did much more advanced things in their senior year of high school, I was starting to think about that stuff when I was in elementary school. And so I wanted to talk about something else that happens with inventions that you might not think about. So there was a scientist in the 1940s. He was a mechanical engineer working on ships, and he was trying to make big metal springs. And he needed really stable springs to be able to help make the ships operate really well. But then all of a sudden one day he had a spring that wasn't very stable and didn't help support the structure. So what do you think he could have done with that spring? What? He did. He is the inventor of a slinky. So that's another thing that happens with inventions. You're working on one problem and you solve another one. There was another scientist that was working for a glue company. And so when you make glues, generally you want to stick something on there and you want it to last forever. So this scientist was working in the lab one day, and he made a glue that when you stick it on, you could peel it off and stick it on and peel it off, and it only took light pressure to get it to stick. So the company said, this is worthless. Who would care about that? If I want glue, I want it to stay there forever. Well, what's something that could have came out of that? Yeah? Yeah, Post-its, which everybody uses. They're all over the world. And we know how useful they can be at remembering when you have to take the garbage out, do your homework. So that's another invention that came out of an unintended project. But so a lot happened to me in elementary school. I didn't know exactly what I wanted to be. I actually wanted to be a maid because I like to clean up, which is, I know most people don't, but I did. I wanted to be a vet for a while. I wanted to be a chef. But I do know things that I came in contact with that I became passionate about. I just didn't know how I could use that later on. And I remember distinctly getting a handout in elementary school that talked about the different types of energy in our country and electricity. Remember we talked about Sarah's project, making new biofuels for transportation. So here is all the different ways we can get energy in the country. So can someone raise their hand and tell me one way we get? So let's talk about not just energy, but electricity. So like in your home, the ability to be able to flick on a light switch and have the lights come on. Your cell phone, the fact that we're able to have portable power in our pocket to call people and look up facts. Or your car, you can turn the key and start your car. There's a lot of electricity running through everything. So raise your hand if you know one place we get electricity. Windmills, who said it? Nice, that's a renewable energy system. Very good. What's another one? Nuclear energy, yes, so there's two kinds of nuclear. There's nuclear fission, which we've been doing for a long time, and Tennessee is one of the founding states for that with Oak Ridge National Lab, where we actually break atoms apart and we take all that energy and we convert it into electricity. But there's also fusion, which is the way the sun gets its energy. It brings things together. And so what we're trying to do right now is do fusion on Earth as a way to be able to create energy. So nuclear is great. What's another one? Hydropower, yes, because we've got our dams where we can have the water running through and run our turbines to create electricity. Do I have one over here? What's a way we can get energy? What's something else we can get from the sun? Solar energy. And that's very much related to polymers. There's two different ways to make solar energy. You can do inorganic solar cells, or you can do polymers. And with polymers, the theory is if you had a polymer that could absorb the sun's energy, you could paint it on your roof. So we all have roofs. I wouldn't care if they painted something on my roof that was going to give me some free electricity. So that's kind of a longer term thing they're trying to do with solar energy. What's another one we didn't talk about? Geothermal, that's a great one. So, because the Earth's below the Earth's surface, we have consistent temperatures, and you could tap into that and be able to create electricity. But actually, we have traditional energy too. We didn't talk about coal, natural gas. We have a huge natural gas boom in this country. Not very long ago, we were actually buying natural gas from other countries, and natural gas is very, very expensive. Well, recently, we've developed a new way in this country to extract natural gas, and we are actually selling natural gas to other parts of the world. And we're looking at how that will bring back manufacturing jobs to this country and how it becomes a source of revenue. But now it's important, like all these different technologies have pluses and minuses, that we have to do it in a responsible way for ourselves, for the environment, for the future, and for everyone across the globe. So yeah, you guys see, energy is interesting. That's why I like it. There's no one size fits all. Every problem you have has its own solution, whether I need power in my pocket or power at my house. So that's really what got me to fall in love with energy. And these are some of our great inventors in energy. So Ben Franklin is actually the name of my elementary school. I don't think I would have thought, I'm 29 years old with my PhD. I don't think I would have thought when I was 6 or 7, that one day I'd be standing here in front of you with a picture of Ben Franklin talking about my inventor contest, but I'm here. Michael Day Faraday, Louis Latimer, Thomas Edison, I'm sure some of you have heard of, and Nikola Tesla. And here are some girls right here doing experiments that were very similar to what the Greek philosophers did in 600 BC, where they were rubbing amber against a cloth, and they observed that light objects could stick to the cloth. I'm sure some of you guys have done this with balloons. You rub it on your hair, pull it away, and sticks there. That's your static electricity. And people didn't actually use the word electric until the 1600s. William Gilbert actually wrote the theory of magnetism. So it's very recently that we really started to understand electricity and take advantage of it. So now I wanted to get to where I was graduating from high school. I always think it's fun to see what somebody looked like. So this was me when I was your age, and I was ready to go and leave Connecticut and go off to Vermont. I did want to tell you about my first chemistry teacher. I was very fortunate in high school, and we had a chemistry class. And my first chemistry teacher was originally a WWF announcer. So I was very fortunate. He had a lot of character, a lot of interesting things. I don't know if this is going to work in the room this size, but I went into class one day, and I was sitting over here, and he was shaking something around, and it started to smell. He was actually spraying fart spray in the room. He was an interesting character, and he said, "You guys know it stinks. This is perfume, though. You smell it? You guys, can you smell it over there? You can, and now what's going on? How come you can smell it and you can't?" Well, if once you're able to smell it, it's going to be diffusion. What were you saying? What would you like? Yes? Particles. Exactly. So she's correct. She's saying that the particles spread in one area and they proliferate around. Because if we took all of you guys and we shoved ourselves, I'm pretty sure we could fit in this corner, but are we happy? Especially if it gets hot and humid. No, we want to spread out across this room. And that's just like gas particles, or if you put a little colored dye in your water, it doesn't stay in that dark drop. It spreads out through the water. So this is the process of diffusion. This is something you analyze all the time when you're a scientist. When I'm looking in the microscope, I could be looking at, for example, high corrosion resistant steel. And I could be looking at the surface where the environment's interacting with it, and I'm going to actually look below the surface and see different species that have migrated below the surface, and I can map that with my electron microscopes and really understand whether I'm increasing or decreasing properties. Is this steel going to last longer? Is it going to be more expensive? So diffusion is something that, as basic as that little drop of colored dye in your water, or us not wanting to be squished in that room, we can constantly be looking at that all throughout your entire lives in science. So he did that, I remember, with his tie-dye lab coat. And I had no idea that I would go on to be a polymer chemist. I'd studied chemistry in Vermont and polymer chemistry in New York. So now we are switching states. And the other thing that happened to me when I got up to Vermont when I was studying polymer chemistry, and as we heard earlier, in college you work really hard. I wouldn't say I was the smartest, but I was the hardest working, or at least one of the hardest working students. And that's what it's about. It's about perseverance and going through. And I was a big believer in if my professors asked me to do it, they knew I could handle it. Even if I thought I couldn't and I was nervous and scared, they're asking me to do it, and I buckle down and I put in the time and effort, I'm going to be able to figure it out. And if I go after and ask for extra help, they're going to give it to me. And so I was constantly in my professor's offices asking questions. And the other thing I was really fortunate at is in college, and long before that too, but I got very involved in volunteering, and we had international and domestic volunteering trips that we could do over our winter and spring break. And so I went to Florida and worked in homeless transition centers, California for immigrant rights and helping people do English as a second language classes and citizenship test training. I could never pass my citizenship test without studying, so it was a really interesting learning experience and exposure to things that I had no idea growing up in Connecticut. Like I said, my bubble that I was in was so much smaller, and going away to college really expanded that. I'd never even been in a moving airplane before college. My first time in a moving airplane was in my freshman class. We actually got to fly over the Lake Champlain water basin in Vermont, and I even got to fly the plane. So they took it away from me when I thought I was hitting birds because I didn't understand turbulence. But it was pretty awesome. And so you never know what's going to happen when you just start going out and being flexible and curious and exploring different things. And so here I'm in Mexico, where I love to go volunteer doing community development work, and I'm mixing adobe with my hands, which you can use adobe to make bricks to build your home. And we were using this adobe in particular to finish off a woman's kitchen. I actually lived with her for a few weeks. And what you can see here is this is actually a stovetop, and you put a real wood-burning fire in the bottom of the stovetop. But we had just installed this pipe. So before this pipe was installed, it would be very common for women to be in this small enclosed space for 6-8 hours a day, cooking, making yummy fresh food for their family, out of necessity and just out of carrying on their cultural traditions, and it's delicious. But the woman's enclosed in a room with an open fire and breathing in all that smoke. It would be equivalent to smoking a few packs of cigarettes a day, just cooking for her family. So by installing this simple pipe, we were able to remove her exposure to all of that smoke. Can you imagine the benefits in your health? Is smoking good for you? No. And here's this woman just working hard for her family and getting all that bad stuff. So here's a really simple way that when an engineer and a scientist came up with to be able to help improve their health. And so when I was volunteering in Mexico, I started to really realize how much people strive to have access to electricity and the extremes they went to and the change in their quality of life. You can imagine if you were only able to study, if you were fortunate enough to be able to go to school and study, and you could only study by the sunlight, think about what happens in the winter when you can barely get home before it's dark. So once you have access to electricity, you can study at night. So that you're even changing the window of people's accessibility to being able to have education. And when you look at the world at night, you can see there is some parts of the world that have light, but there's plenty of other parts of the world that don't have much electricity. And in the US, we talk about our transmission lines. Does anyone think our transmission lines are really efficient and stable? Have you guys ever heard about our cybersecurity? So they talk about in the US, one of our biggest risks right now is to our transmission lines, our grid system. It's a very inefficient, old fish system. It's very patchworked and patchworked across the country, and so they talk about that's a very big vulnerability for our country. Think about when a storm comes through. What's one of the first things that happens? We lose our electricity. And then we're immediately like, don't open the fridge because we've got to keep the fridge cold. Our food's going to go bad. And immediately the trucks are coming out trying to fix our electricity. And so we don't necessarily have the perfect solution today with our transmission lines. So it's probably highly unlikely that we're going to run transmission lines all over the rest of the world. And so when I started thinking about that, I got very interested in distributed power generation. The plants that we talked about earlier, a lot of those are centralized productions. I'm a big plant. I produce electricity. I send it out to people where they need it on their transmission lines. And even though I'm this big plant, maybe I've got heat coming off, it's wasted heat because there's not a house next door to that plant that needs to use that heat. But if I can make this plant smaller and put it next to my house, now the heat that's coming off my plant can be used to actually heat my house. My electricity just goes a short distance. There's less losses. So that's called distributed power generation, smaller units all over the country. So these can kind of play into our larger centralized system and increase the resiliency of our grid. And one technology in particular is called hydrogen fuel cells. Does anyone know what a fuel cell is? Don't worry. Oh, you do? You did? What do you remember from fuel cells? Yep, they're a way to get energy. What did you know about fuel cells? Did I see one more hand? No? Okay. Yep, so they're definitely a way to get energy. The first fuel cells were used on a spaceship. Actually, on the spaceship they use what's called an alkaline fuel cell. The kind I worked on is called a proton exchange membrane fuel cell. So in one way to think about a fuel cell is it's almost like an Oreo cookie, right? So you've got your Oreo cookie, and you've got the two dark chocolate cookies on the outside. I'm going to call those my electrodes. It's like a sandwich. In the middle, there's the cream. Or it could be a polymer membrane, which could look like a fruit roll-up. And so on each side of my cookie, I'm going to supply a fuel on one side, and then air on the other side. And then I'm going to have a reaction that's very, very efficient. And the only byproduct of this reaction is water. And this system that I'm talking about, so you can think about your Oreo cookie is this big. And if I'm really hungry, maybe I'll eat a stack of Oreo cookies. And if I'm trying to feed all you guys, I better bring, a whole box, a case of Oreo cookies so we can have a lot. So that's the thing I like about fuel cells. It's very scalable. If I only need one cookie for maybe my cell phone, I can have that in my pocket. And then outside my house, I can have a case of Oreo cookies. And all I need is to have that fuel we talked about, and then air, and then the byproduct is water. So it's a very interesting system, and that's what I studied because I believed in this distributed generation. And so when I was in Vermont and in New York, I started doing research. One of the first things I did, what did I say I love to do? Volunteer. So my freshman year in college, I went up to my professor and said, can I volunteer in your lab? I had no idea what I was going to be working in, but you have to get in and get your hands wet and see what it's like. And whether that's marketing or that's nursing, I know there were a lot of people interested in nursing earlier that I talked to. You've got to get in and ask your professor, can I volunteer? You guys can volunteer at the hospitals right now. You just have to fill out the paperwork and commit the time. But that's the way you're going to know if you want to do something or not. So I volunteered in that lab. I didn't really like it. The next year I volunteered in a different lab. Oh, this felt a little bit better. The next year I volunteered in a different lab. And so that's a really good way to get some exposure, and eventually you start getting credits for it. Eventually you start getting paid for it. You heard about some money before. You get paid pretty fast once you start going into a technical or science field, or even any of these other programs you're in. Once you start to know one course, you can tutor a student from the previous course the next semester and start making extra money. So here's a picture of my school in Vermont. I went to the University of Vermont, and I very much, I'm a first-generation college student. I was raised by my single mom. She was an incredibly hardworking woman, but I know since I was like this big that she regretted, and even to this day, that she didn't go to college. And so my whole life growing up, I knew that I wanted to go to college. I didn't know what I wanted to study, what I was going to do with it, or maybe even why, except for that I had been hearing from my mom that it was her biggest regret. And so I had to get to college. And my situation, I didn't have someone to pay for me to go there. And so I needed to make it affordable. And so my volunteer work led to scholarships. I worked hard in school. I got some academic scholarships. And then I applied to as many schools as I could. I didn't get into my top schools. Maybe I should have studied a little bit harder. But I did get into the University of Vermont with a very nice financial aid package that it became the most affordable school for me. I actually went through 4 years of school and came out with $3,000 of debt, which is incredibly low, actually. And the only reason I came out with that debt is because I bought a computer, because I didn't even have a computer. I didn't have internet in my house growing up, and you can still make it. And $3,000 worth of debt, I was able to pay that off a few years after school pretty quickly. So here's a whole bunch of people I met during my program. I don't know if you can see it, but there's definitely a big international community when you go into technology and science. And that's actually, because you saw I like to volunteer in Mexico, I love learning about other cultures and all the exposure I get to learning about the different ways people live and think and solve problems. And that's actually one of the strengths that they're looking for in science and technology teams, because you're going to address problems in a different way and think about them differently and come to better, more interesting solutions. And growing up in Connecticut, I would probably have never met people from these different communities, because we had a diverse population, but it was not international population in Connecticut. I'm even wearing a salwar kameez from India. I didn't even know that word existed, but now I do, and I'm going to my friend's wedding from grad school in Mumbai this December. I never knew I would go to India. Certainly never knew I'd go to Tennessee. You think I was thinking about India? Tennessee didn't even mean anything when I was little. And now I love it here. And so here's actually a poster. It's a research presentation. I've heard from some of you that you're already making PowerPoints in your classes for projects, and that's how scientists communicate with each other all the time. We travel like this around the country. We get together. We present our PowerPoint presentations to each other to get feedback, to learn about how you're working on this project. Can we work together, collaborate, solve more problems? Because if I do it in the lab and I can't tell you about it, it's worthless. It might as well have not been done. So that's really important in science, is sharing and communicating. And another way to do it than PowerPoints is these poster presentations. And Eula is actually from Poland, and she's giving that presentation right there. And she's a single mom. And she is in grad school right there, and she has a 5-year-old daughter. And she recently, defended a couple years ago, and she's working full-time. So here's a picture of me when I finished my PhD in New York with my sister. She's actually a high school math teacher. Over here is a picture of my school in New York, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. It's a small engineering school. I decided to go there because they were very strong in that system I talked about before, fuel cells. And so this kind of shows you what I was talking about, but it's not an Oreo cookie. So you can see there's a fuel coming in, and the fuel that we care about in my system is called hydrogen. And the air coming in, so air has oxygen, and that's actually why I'm feeding the air in. It's a free source of my oxygen. And in the middle of that is a membrane. And here's a picture of the membrane I worked with. And it looks very much like a fruit roll-up. And the membrane is very important because it's got a couple of jobs. The number one job it has, it's got to keep the oxygen and the hydrogen, the fuel and the air separate. So that cream in the middle, it's got to be a gas barrier, because I don't want these two to mix together. It's got to be an electrical insulator. So an electrical insulator means it doesn't allow electrons through. And the reason that matters is because I need that electron to travel outside in this outside wire, and that's where I'm going to tap in and get my power, because this is going to generate power for me. And then also, it needs to transfer protons. So proton's a positively charged species. So in hydrogen's made up of a proton and an electron. So I'm going to somehow split the proton and electron and send that electron through this external circuit, and then I'm going to send that proton through my membrane. And then the proton and electron are going to combine with oxygen from the environment. So who knows what happens when you combine a proton, an electron, and oxygen? Any ideas? Anyone heard of H2O? Yeah? Just give me some nods. H2O, that's hydrogen and oxygen. Remember I said the fuel cell byproduct is water. That's how we got it. We took a proton, an electron, and an oxygen. You guys just did electrochemistry and you didn't know it. So, as I said, when I was in graduate school, I started interning in Tennessee. I had a fellowship, so as you're going through, you're going to start seeing there's different ways. I loved volunteering, so through my time at ORNL, I kept volunteering. And here's a picture of, I got very much into hiking. I'm actually an avid hiker with my dog. We just did a 3-day backpacking trip in Virginia over Labor Day weekend. And we're doing a 5K run with my really good hiking friend for Race for the Cure, so raising money for breast cancer in Knoxville. Here's one of my really good electrochemistry friends. She's a teacher at Tennessee Tech. We met at a conference, kind of like you guys are meeting right now. We met at a conference in D.C. about 6 years ago. And these are her 2 kids, Owen and Courtney. And then here I am. We're at this amusement center not very far from here, near Cookeville, so you guys might even know it. And here's my really good friend, Ashley. And so I met Ashley when she was about 10 years old through a program very similar to Big Brothers Big Sisters. And she is now 15, just started high school. And she has probably been the most meaningful thing that's happened to me in the last few years. And even in that time where I've moved and had all these great experiences, it's just really important to feel connected that you're helping someone. And kind of like I'm hoping that you guys will meet some great mentors today. You have so many volunteers you're interacting with. It's really important to have people in your life that believe in you and that you can ask questions to, because that's really the way you're going to move forward. I think you heard this morning someone talked about start thinking about future connections and career paths and questions, and take people's emails down today. Maybe you don't have a question today, but one of you might decide a year from now you're interested in fuel cells. So come and get my email and send me an email a few years from now and be like, hey, we met at EYH in 2013. I'm thinking about fuel cells. What do you think? You know, that's how you're going to move through the world. And then here's actually a picture of my mom. I met some girls in the middle school group that wanted to be bakers. And so chemists are actually known for being really good cooks sometimes, although I tend to experiment. So my mom will say when I was younger, my cooking was sort of terrible. Nowadays, most people like it. We're at a cooking class in Knoxville. And so actually, chemistry is really similar to cooking in the lab. You're following recipes, you're measuring things, you're watching temperatures, you're observing, you're constantly observing what's going on, because that's the way you're going to really solve interesting problems. So that's in the lab with chemicals and safety and goggles and lab coats. It's like the same thing you do in the kitchen, because in the kitchen, you've got your recipe, you've got your burners, your ingredients, you have to measure things properly, especially bakers. I think if who's baked before? Yeah? What happens if you forget to put an egg in a recipe? It's really nasty. Has anyone ever, so I have a friend that really doesn't like sugar, and has anybody ever just removed the sugar from a recipe because they were trying to be healthy? See, this will happen to you guys when you're not at this age. When you get closer to 30, you'll start cutting down your sugar. You'll find out that sugar's in there for a reason, and it tastes terrible when you take all the sugar out. Especially pecan pie, which is like all sugar. You need some sugar. So I wanted to tell you a little bit more about my research in Tennessee. So I was a chemist, chemistry training in Vermont. I did polymer chemistry for the fuel cell system in New York. And I started going down to Tennessee doing scattering experiments and microscopy experiments. And when I became a staff scientist there about 3 years ago, I joined the microscopy group. And so I kept working on the same system and the membrane, but I kind of expanded to other materials, and I became more of an expert in the technique. And so these are 3 different systems I'm showing you here, and the scale changes. Is anybody familiar? Have they heard the word nanometer? Nanometer? Yeah? Have you heard the word micrometer? Yeah? So which one's smaller? A nanometer? Raise your hand if you think a nanometer is smaller, or a micrometer. Nanometer smaller. Raise your hand. I do. So that's 10 to the minus 9 meters. That's really, really tiny. And then a micrometer, so there's the nanometer is the one in the center, and a micrometer is 10 to the minus 16. So, 10 to the minus 6. So a micrometer, we call it micron, is 10 to the minus 6, so that's one scale. And then you drop it down 3 orders of magnitude, so divide it by 1,000, and you get nanometer, and that's 10 to the minus 9. And then you get sub-angstrom, which is 10 to the minus 10. And when we get down into this world, we start seeing single atoms. This is my friend, actually, the one that doesn't want the sugar, Miaofeng Qi. She's from China. She's one of my best friends. Her daughter just turned 2 this year. She's a great girl. So here, she's actually an expert microscopist, world famous, and she's only about 34-ish, I think. Here is called the Titan microscope. It was part of the original team project. This microscope is at Oak Ridge National Lab, and this is when our country was working to achieve sub-angstrom, sub 10 to the minus 9 resolution, to be able to see individual atoms in the country. At the top of this, so these microscopes are called electron microscopes. You might be familiar with light microscopes in your labs. Has anybody used a light microscope? Yeah? So the light goes in, and you're looking at it through the lenses, and you're using the light to be able to see anything. So in our electron microscopes, we have an electron gun coming up through the top and an electron beam hitting the sample. So this whole part up is the electron gun. From here down is the corrector. So when you want to see when you want to see individual atoms, you need this thing called a corrector, which removes all the inhomogeneities, the discontinuities, the imperfections in the lenses and in the beam. You need a perfect beam to be able to see these individual atoms. So you either need to correct the beam before it hits the sample or after it hits the sample. But you can see that's a significant amount of the equipment is just correcting that beam there. So if we go back to a little bit lower resolution, we're at the 10 to the minus 9. This is called our HF 3300. And if you notice, we're going to talk about TEM and STEM a little bit. And then this is a little bit lower resolution. Here it gets you down to more the micron scale, but you can see nanometer scale there too. And this instrument's called an SEM. So in an SEM, it's a scanning electron microscope. So remember, we know what electron is. That's the electron beam hitting the sample. So now I'm going to do different things to it. So in an SEM, are we on time? In an SEM, you're going to scan the beam across the top of the sample. It's almost like if you were to blow up the sample and be able to see it with your bare eyes. And with these other samples, the signals get a little bit more complicated, but you can learn more about the structure and chemistry as you go through here and interpret the signals. But an important part to remember, with all these different samples, with all these different microscopes, there's different size samples that can fit into them. There's actually microscopes in Tennessee that you could walk into. They're that big. I could go in. I don't want to go in the microscope. That would be hit with an electron beam. But you could walk in. You could put a big part, maybe from a car or a truck that you're trying to analyze. But when you start getting down to these microscopes where you see individual atoms, the samples are like the size of my eyelash. I literally, when I'm preparing the sample, I will use an eyelash to pick up that piece of the sample and set it on the grid. That's how delicate these samples are. So when we're doing microscopy, it's kind of like if you were going to a forest. And you're going to a forest and you're trying to understand a forest. Does anyone have an idea of something you might look at in the forest? Maybe what kind of trees are there? What animals live there? If there's water. So you're going to this forest, and the only thing I give you to tell you about the forest is one leaf. From that one leaf, I need to make all these interpretations about the forest. So that better be a really good leaf, right? It should represent. What if I'm walking along and I've got chewing gum on my foot, and there's a leaf on that chewing gum all squished up, and I'm gonna pick that. Should I pick that leaf off and go look at it and analyze? What conclusion might I come to if I have a leaf with gum on it? I'm gonna say, oh, this forest is full of trees with gum all over them. Is that accurate? No, so it's really important the leaf I pick to look at is representative of everything going on, because I only have a small area I'm looking at. That's a really key when we're doing microscopy. And then most recently, being an Oak Ridge National Lab employee, I got offered an opportunity to go to Washington, D.C., And so I moved there back in November for 2 years. And so I flew down yesterday just to be with you guys because Judith had invited me down and she told me about this great conference. And so I'm really excited to see a little bit more before I head out today. And I went to Washington, D.C. because I really wanted to understand the intersection between science and policy. Does anyone have any ideas why science and policy matter? Why do they relate? Why do they overlap a little bit? So remember how important it was for me to be able to flick on that light switch? And when we have the storms come through and the utility trucks come out and they have to fix the electricity. And we talked about jobs earlier and how important those are. Some people might work at manufacturing plants and how we want to have more manufacturing jobs for people, how we want to have more things made in the U.S. so we can sell them to each other in the U.S. and then the rest of the world so we can develop new solutions. All that has to do, in my mind, a lot of that has to do with energy and how we can produce energy in this country cheaply and safely. And so the government has a big role in supporting or pursuing different technologies and initiatives in this country. And so we are very much affected at Oak Ridge National Lab by different presidents, by different senators, by different departments. We have a Department of Energy actually in this country, so we have a significant emphasis by the government helping to support which technologies we pursue, which solutions we help pay for, because the biggest supporter of basic research in our country, which is where a lot of these interesting solutions come from, is the federal government. So I went up there back in November. Here's actually a picture of President Obama's inauguration with my mom. So it was pretty fun. She turned 50 this past spring. And here's Bill Nye the Science Guy. So there's a lot of really interesting people you get to meet when you're up in D.C. He was just there about a month or two ago supporting NASA research. And Judith, like I said, I met her in D.C. She was up there letting us know about this conference. So we're really fortunate. A lot of people come to us to tell us the great things they're doing. I came here to you guys because I wanted to see the great things you were doing. And I just wanted to say thank you for your attention. I know I went a little bit long, but I think it's really important. If you guys, I think all the speakers this morning said you really have to follow your interests, and you never know where it's going to take you. Tennessee didn't mean anything to me when I was in elementary school, and now I love your state. And India was a figment of my imagination, and now some of my best friends are from there. And I'm really hoping one day I can help move distributed energy generation further. But can you guys name what's like one of the huge things that allowed me to have all these opportunities? I need a hand. Someone raise their hand. Say that again. Being self-motivated, yes, because I'm the one that had to make myself stay up till 3 a.m. studying and get up and be there at 7 a.m. to come to a science conference in the morning. Self-motivated. What's another thing I needed? Anybody? Perseverance. Yes, that was huge. I think that's what a PhD is all about. You all could be doctors. You just have to persevere. Research is about failing, big failures and little successes. Because if we solved all the problems, we wouldn't have any more research jobs. So think about it as job stability. What's another thing? Confidence. Yes, you do need confidence, but you know how you build your confidence? It's by working hard and proving to yourself you can do it and being a self-motivator. So you don't have to have it right away. And sometimes when those experiments are failing, your confidence really gets beat up. And you have to remember why you're doing it and keep going and persevering. But the big thing, I think, the most important thing is education. I wouldn't be here right now if I didn't go to college, and I wouldn't be here right now if I didn't continue for my doctorate. And so it's all about you guys working hard in school. That's your number one job. It's not paying for your gas tank to be able to go out with your friends. It's education. And I thought that when my teacher told me that in high school, I thought she was crazy. I was like, I need my part-time job. Who's going to put gas in my tank? Who's going to buy me pizza? Who's going to get me my new shoes? You know, I thought that was the most important thing, and it's not. I tell Ashley this every day. She's known it since she was 10 years old, and I hope that she'll finally listen to me, but we all have to figure it out on our own. Your number one job right now is your education. It's not your rent. It's not your clothes. It's not your cell phone, because that's not what's going to get you somewhere in the future. And so once again, thank you for your attention. And I do believe we have at least, we have about 10 minutes or so for questions, right? Anybody have some? Colleges. Uh, so for the research that's going on, or the way the students are able to attend? So one of the biggest funders for basic research in this country is the federal government. And so the federal government funds through different agencies. There's the National Science Foundation, the Department of Energy's Office of Science, which is the main way I'm funded through. And then there's NIST, the NIST funds education programs, and NASA, the space exploration, they directly fund fellowships and fund research. Companies also will interact with professors when your research is further from basic or more applied, and a company can see it as helping their portfolio more, then they're more likely to collaborate and fund. But yes, the federal government does fund. So we get together and we collaborate with other scientists and write proposals. Okay. What's your name? Taylor. So Taylor's got great questions, and her second question was, she thinks it's really cool I work for the U.S. Senate, and how did that come about? Because that's not what I thought it would be. So a lot of that was at Oak Ridge National Lab. I was a research scientist, and you find when you're in science that the funding from the government shifts. So when I was in grad school, there was lots of funding for hydrogen fuel cells. And then all of a sudden, the funding dropped for hydrogen fuel cells, and there was lots of funding for batteries. And I didn't understand that. Why did that happen? Who said it? Well, a lot of that comes from the government. And so I really wanted to get involved more with these, they call them technology offices in Department of Energy. So I wanted to be able to understand who was making these decisions, where the connections were coming from, on why we fund different things, and why that has such a direct impact in which science we're studying. And so I started interviewing internally at Oak Ridge and became the internal lab candidate for a fellowship. And so this fellowship, our senior senator from Tennessee, Senator Alexander, he requests to have a staff scientist on hand from Oak Ridge National Lab because he has very important decisions to make related to energy. And since we are Department of Energy lab at Oak Ridge, we gladly fill that request and find him a scientist that's willing to come up and work in his office for 2 years. And I work with him all the way from nuclear, traditional energy generation using natural gas. Natural gas, who was that? You were over here, right? Yeah, I thought so. A natural gas to renewables, my wind girls over there, to solar, to STEM education, and all the way to tech transfer and how to get real value out of some of the research we're doing in the lab, because the government does spend a lot of money, and the government spends our money. We're the taxpayers, and so we want to see good things coming out of that, and so trying to communicate that with people and help move it forward. Did that answer some of your question? Yes? A subatomic? They're still working on that. But you could do that. Let me check the other side of the room. Were there questions over here? You guys good? Okay. Yep. So the original fuel cells that were on the spaceship, the idea was the astronauts could drink it. And in theory, if everything's perfectly clean, you could drink it. It could be drinking water. It could be a source of drinking water. I personally don't want to drink it unless there's a filter before it. Then maybe I'd consider drinking it. But yeah, you can imagine if you were, there's lots of incredible applications for fuel cells because water is so important. And we don't talk about it enough nowadays, but one day that's probably all we'll be talking about. And fuel cells, the fact that its byproduct is water, and it's clean, potable water, if you have a little filter at the end of it, could really be a solution. You can imagine if you're living in a rural area, off the grid, that water becomes a big issue. Is there another question over here? All right. We still have a few minutes, right? Okay. So I want to hear more from you guys. I want to hear what you want to do. What do you want to, do you have any idea what you want to study? Yeah. Want to be a vet? What? Oh, so equine orthopedic vet. And so what's the first thing you're going to have to do if you want to be a vet? College, to go to vet school. And you guys are really lucky in Tennessee. You have the vet school at UT. Guarantee is an incredible vet school. People come from all over the place, and I didn't know this, but it's really important if you do want to be a vet to let people know right away when you start college, because sometimes there's accelerated programs that could get you, I'm not certain on this, sometimes guaranteeing admission into the vet. Vet school nowadays is more competitive than med school. So if you want to be a vet, that's one where you kind of want to decide early and let people know early, because you really have to line up the rows so it becomes easier for you. That's a great field, and you would wait for it because you're at vet school. What about, what fields are you interested in? Yeah. In math? So what's something you could do with math? You heard about a couple of math people today. One I'm related to, one spoke to you earlier. What's something you could do with math? Something in engineering. There's lots of math in engineering. Actually, my first 2 years of chemistry classes, all I did was math. And I loved math growing up. I don't know how I didn't end up majoring in math. Actually, I do. It was a professor. He's a really great professor, and he just said, oh, you should stick with this. You're doing really well. And then all of a sudden, one day, I did a little bit less math than chemistry, and I got really sad. I was like, I should have kept going with math. But it all works out. You never know where it's going to go. Yeah, engineering is all math. That's a great. What areas you're interested in? Music? That's great. What kind of music? So there was, I don't remember. I was surprised though, some of the work at the labs, a lot of it's outreaches with different companies because we have all these great capabilities. And at one of the national labs in Sandia, New Mexico, they actually had a musician that applied for a grant to be able to use their facilities. And you have to give me your email because I'm going to send it to you. Because I think he was making an instrument more accessible to handicapped individuals, and the way he was able to achieve that was by interacting with the national lab. So give me your email beforehand, before you leave, because I think you might find that interesting. And you would never know that. Who would think science and technology? I bet you're sitting here like, oh, I'm going to tell her music, and it's not science and technology, but they overlap, and you never know when you're going to be able to help each other, and you don't know until you talk and you communicate. Another one, what are you interested in? Chemical engineering? So you're right in there. Do you know what year are you in? You're a junior, so are you looking at schools now? A huge list, yeah, I remember that. That's a great field. Do you know at all what you want to do with chemical engineering? Well, you're right there with me. So we've got a new green chemical engineer over here working on renewable energies and fuel cells, and Tennessee Tech, where my friend actually, so she's a chemist by training, electrochemistry, a type of chemistry, and she's a teacher now in a chemical engineering department. So the funny thing is, you'll learn that we can really overlap when we get past the school time with these other disciplines. I actually work mostly with material scientists and physicists. I'm the only chemist in my group. But when you're younger and you're starting out, it's actually a little bit difficult to communicate between a chemist and a chemical engineer because we know different vocabulary. And if you can break that barrier, the sooner you can break that, the stronger scientist you're going to be. Because I didn't have to break it until I was in grad school and had that fellowship that started sending me to Tennessee. And I started interacting with the chemical engineers. And we were just immediately what are you talking about? I don't understand you. And so we had to break it down. We knew the same theories, but we thought about things differently. That's great. What about you? Do you know what you want to do? Yeah. Oh, sorry. You had told me early. Sorry. I talked to lots of people. So she wants to major in psychology to be a criminal psychologist. And there's actually a lot of work in Tennessee in the forensics department. So if anybody knows what schools are good for psychology and criminal analysis, please talk to her because I didn't have any good advice. With all these other people, I have a good comment. Other than I think it's really interesting and timely. So anybody in the room can connect her with someone? Here we go. See, we're helping each other. Missouri's a good college for that. So Missouri's a good college for it, or there is one in Missouri. And then I bet you before you go, you need to talk to an MTSU student. Where are the MTSU people? and we need to find out if MTSU has a good program in that for her. So that's, you got another, I know your to-do list is so long. I'm sorry to give you more. We appreciate that because we need some answers, right? And that's how we're going to help each other. What do you want to study? Marketing? So you already got your contact. Before you head out today, are you going to get someone's email address? Maybe. I hope so. That's the key. So everyone kept asking, how do you get your, I think people asked about how you decide what you want to do and how you get your first job. In science at least, most of your jobs come from conferences and interacting with people and going to have coffee afterwards and talk about the presentation. And they say, oh, I have this problem. I'm really looking to hire someone to work in the field. And you actually get your job offers at conferences just like this, or internship offers. If I had a research group and one of you guys were interested, I'm in DC right now though, potentially if our interests overlapped and you wanted to come out to Tennessee, you'd be able to talk to me about that. At least you'd be able to ask me and get advice about how to do it in the future. And that's kind of like the goal of these conferences. What do you want to study? A pediatric nurse. That's a great field. So what's the first thing you have to do? Go to college. And why did you decide you wanted to be a pediatric nurse? So first she wanted to be a pediatrician, and then she decided a nurse might be a better job, and she just likes kids. So it's really important to do what you like, what you're interested in, and what has, I believe we have to make sure we add purpose in there too. But I do think it's really important. You want to do things that you like because you spend a lot of time at work in your career, and you want to have impact. And sometimes you never realize, how you could have impact one day. The girl earlier that wanted to be a baker, there's a lot of people that are gluten intolerant nowadays. Maybe she could develop a whole, nutrition line for gluten intolerant people. So there's a lot of application on things that you may never think of and really timely problems that we are working to solve. Are we on time? 5 minutes. Anybody have questions? Did that stir up any questions in anyone? Yes? Okay. So this question's because I'm very young, but I've kind of done a little bit already for my young age, and the timing it took for everything. So I just happened, the rules were a little different when I started school, so I graduated when I was 17 from high school, not because I skipped a grade or anything, just because I could start a little earlier back then. They changed the rules. So I went from, I started college at 17, and then I graduated college in 4 years. And then because I went into chemistry, so there's the hard sciences and the soft sciences. So hard science would be chemistry, physics in particular. When you go into those fields for grad school, you actually generally get paid to go to school, which is awesome. So no more student loans. And you get a small stipend to live off of. You can't really afford much, but you can at least feed yourself and not be going into debt. And then I went into graduate school, and the other thing that's nice about the hard sciences is that you go into graduate school, and if you've graduated from a U.S. institution with a bachelor's in science, you generally don't have to get a master's first. So I could go directly into a PhD program, and I finished my PhD in 4.5 years. I spent probably about half my time in New York and then half of my time in Tennessee with that internship. It kept getting extended every time I went back to New York. I would get asked to come back to Tennessee, or I'd asked to come back because it's so great down here. So that was 4.5 years. And then because I had been down at the lab for almost 3 years on and off at that time, I interviewed for a staff scientist position, and I was fortunate enough to join the microscopy group. And so I was a microscopist in the microscopy group for about 3 years. And I started hearing about this fellowship that they had at the U.S. Senate that I was very interested in, trying to get a better understanding for public policy. And luckily, timing, it was really all about timing and networking and just showing people that I was willing to work hard. Did that help? Yeah. Thanks. I defended in 2009, if that gives you an idea of timing, too. More questions? There's one. Oh, thank you. Yeah, so I took it for granted, and that's the important part about communication. You need to have friends around that can tell you, like, hey, maybe you need to break down this area over here because you're not really being clear. So I appreciate that. Every doctorate program is a little different. And in my doctorate program, after I finished doing I had to come up with a problem and then solve it by doing research. So it had to be a unique problem that other people hadn't solved. And it took me about 4 years to do that. And then once I had finished solving a problem, I had to write my dissertation, which was probably like a 200-page document that maybe 3 people have read, and I don't even ever want to read it again. And it's a lot of work to write it. But it's a great accomplishment. It's something that is always going to be I can be proud of that I worked on. I take this document that's independent research solving a problem in a unique way, and I give it to my committee members. So I have an advisor that I directly work with. Then I also pick about like 4 to 6 people from my department at my college to be on that committee, and they all read this paper, and then I have to go and give them a presentation. This is the defense part, the defending that we talked about. So it's an oral exam essentially, but it starts out with the PowerPoints you guys are doing right now. So to get my doctorate, I was leaning on the ability of PowerPoints, which I failed with today, but luckily it went through. I think I've been clicking accidentally again. And so I give a presentation. The first part of it's open to the public. It's about similar timing as this, a 45-minute, hour-long presentation, and it's showing you kind of all the things I did to solve my problem, why it's interesting, what's unique about it. And you guys in the audience can ask me any questions to say whether I think it's scientifically valid or not. Lots of times you might challenge a method I used and said maybe you should have used this method. And so we'll go back and forth and communicate. You might suggest something I could do in the future. A lot of really good ideas come out of seeing those presentations. So then after the public leaves and I've shown my results to everyone, then I'm alone in that room with that committee of these really, really accomplished professors and my advisor. And my presentation they just saw, and they've all read that 200-page document, and they ask you any question they want. And they ask you the details and why you did this and why you did that. And you have to really be on your toes and ready to, validate your methods that you picked. The important part is your advisor is never going to have you defend unless you are ready to defend. And remember I said when I was in college and I got nervous, I always thought to myself, if my teacher's asking me to do it, even if I'm nervous, it's because they know I can do it. And if I buckle down, I can do it. And so I just held on to that thought. And I was like this the whole time, though. All my pictures, my hands are all like crunched up because I was nervous. And it went great. And I've been really fortunate. I tend to have, whenever I'm getting an exam, it becomes a learning experience. I always think the best teachers give you an exam, and by the end of it, you actually figure something out that you didn't even know you knew at the beginning. They talk about ingredients of a cake, but they don't actually tell you you're making a cake. And then the last question on the exam, if you take that batter and you put it in the oven at 350 degrees for 40 minutes, what do you think comes out? And I think to myself, this sounds like cake. It sounds delicious. And so I just realized I was making a cake that whole time and didn't know it. So luckily for me, a lot of that kind of interaction happened with the committee members. And then you leave that scary room with them, and you stand out in the hallway, and you really rub your fingers then, and you wait to see if they say whether you pass, you don't pass, or you get a conditional pass, which means you have to go back and do work and then repeat that process over. Not 4.5 years, but repeat the presentation and rewrite some of your dissertation. And then I go back in, and they told me I passed. And so that was defending, like literally fighting off that this was a good dissertation I wrote, and then they give me my doctorate, and you have that forever. And the reason I got my doctorate, one of the biggest reasons is, even though it's hard to tell when you're younger, I never wanted to come up to a glass ceiling. I was always scared that one day I would be going along, doing well in my career, and then I would just bump my head on this glass ceiling and be like, you can't come up, you don't have a PhD. Not only are you a woman, but you don't have a PhD. And I never wanted that to be the reason that someone told me I couldn't do something. A little stubborn. Perseverance, right? Thank you.